Hi, everyone, and welcome to Community Conversations. I'm your host, Liz Yang. So today, similar to how the network nervous system, NNS, is the open tokenized governance system that controls the internet computer blockchain, service nervous systems, or SNSs, are algorithmic DAOs that will allow developers to be able to create decentralized token-based governance systems for their dApps. So in this talk, NNS researcher Laura Schmidt will explain a design proposal for a first version of an open governance canister that will then be used to realize the service nervous system. So I'll turn it over to Laura.
Thank you very much, Liz. You can see my screen well, right? Otherwise, let me know.
Yep, we can see it.
Okay, awesome. Thanks. Yeah, welcome everyone also from my side on this talk on the open governance canister for the SNS. So first, let's recap what an SNS is. If I get my mouse working, sorry for that. All right. So first, SNS is short for Service Nervous System. And probably most of you will know what the network nervous system is. It's the open governance system that basically governs the full internet computer. So whenever we, as a community, make a choice to add a new node to the blockchain, or a new node to the ecosystem, or we want to upgrade the replica, basically all these decisions are made collectively by the community, where everyone can participate in this network nervous system. Now, the service nervous system is something very similar, but it governs one individual decentralized application, or also called dApp. So I will start on a high level, explaining a little bit more why we might want an SNS. So what's the motivation and what happened so far basically in this process. And then I will dive into the topic of today, namely the governance canister of this SNS. And along the way, I will also recall some concepts from the NNS that I think are relevant for this talk. But I will, of course, not explain everything in the NNS because we already have other talks. But if something is missing, feel free to shoot a question in the chat. I think there are people that might help there, or we can discuss them in the end. So first, there are a few concepts that are needed for true Web3 applications. In particular, dApps should be hosted fully on-chain end-to-end. So really every aspect, including front-end and everything, should be on the chain. And also, dApps should be owned and controlled by the users. And what we mean by controlled is we really want that if users decide something, these decisions are executed on-chain. So the latter two things actually call for a decentralized autonomous organization, or a DAO. And this is exactly what the SNS is. So two key things that the DAO enables are tokenization and decentralization. And why do we want these things? So first of all, tokenization allows to get, for example, investments. For example, in our case, to pay for the cycles, to actually pay for the dApp that is to run on the IC. Also, tokenization can be used to attract more users, for example, by rewarding early adopters, or by rewarding those that engage a lot with the dApp. And finally, token ownership is also a driver for network effect. So if some users actually own tokens and basically own part of the system, then they are, of course, incentivized to increase the value of this token. And this will likely happen if the dApp is even more popular. So basically, those first users will actually be incentivized to attract even more users and promote the dApp. And then the other thing that's, of course, key in an SNS is the decentralization aspect. So, of course, it's very undesirable if an application is just controlled by one or few central parties who can then just decide to completely change the application or stop the service altogether. Now, the other option to just have, for example, a smart contract that cannot be changed at all is also not desirable in all cases. For example, we might want to be able to adapt to new environments, or we might want to be able to fix, for example, security bugs. Therefore, in this aspect, we really want a decentralized governance that can make such decisions and basically allow the debt to be evolved exactly to the community's needs. So I hope that this motivated a little bit why we want an SNS altogether. Now, of course, you may ask, why do we actually propose a design? We could just have all kinds of DAOs in the wild. We propose a design because a standard helps to make people feel comfortable with interacting with systems. So, for example, if a user already interacts with one SNS, it will then also know how to interact with another SNS. And this will make probably users feel more comfortable by actually investing and engaging with the different SNSs. Also, the final goal for the SNS project is to basically have an SNS on the press of a button. So we basically also want to provide this as a service for those developers who might not have the time or knowledge to develop a full DAO for their dApp themselves. But I want to point out explicitly here that, of course, that doesn't mean that no other DAOs will exist. So by all means, we have an open system. Any developer can, of course, implement their own DAO and also put it on the internet computer. And also, we will make all the code that we do in this SNS project open source. So developers can also, for example, take this code, adapt it to their needs or make small changes and then deploy it just on a normal application subnet. Right. So I hope that this set up a little bit the motivation of why we are doing this overall work. Let me now recall a little bit what has already happened in the SNS context. So basically what community engagements we already had. So in fall, we presented the first SNS design, which included different canisters, how the SNS will be deployed, and also an initial token distribution. We then got some feedback from the community, both after the talk and also on forums. And basically, to sum up some points of this feedback, the community said that this design was too complex and not flexible enough. And some developers also said that they actually don't want this full system. They only want, for example, a ledger or only want a governance canister. So after this feedback, we went back to the drawing board. And to account for this, we now propose the following new approach. So first, we propose to release smaller projects in stages. Basically, as I said, anyways, the full code will be made public and people can use it to their own purposes as well. But now on top of that, the goal is to release intermediate states as soon as they're possible. For example, the canisters, like the governance canister and the ledger canister, we can release them as soon as they're ready, so they can already be used by the community. I think this will also reduce the complexity because breaking it down to these different stages makes the different stages more tangible, also to actually understand what they are doing. And then to further decrease the complexity, we also now propose to simplify the governance canister itself a bit, and we will see more details on that later in the talk. And finally, we also propose to add some configurability to make the different SNSs more flexible. So this is a little bit the context of what has happened so far. Now, today's topic would really be just the governance canister. And as I just mentioned, we want to release this in stages. So it would be about the governance canister. And we also propose to basically start with the first version of this governance canister. And I will every now and then point out some things that we might want, but that we sometimes propose that we will add them in a future step. Because as previously said, we want to release this first version as soon as possible for those who can already use this as a basis, for example, for their own governance system. Right, so just as a small side remark, even though this is the topic of today, we're not only doing this at the moment, so we didn't forget about the ledger. There's already ongoing work to basically improve our ledger so that it can also be used for other purposes. So this is already ongoing. And we're also working on how we can deploy and upgrade SNS systems and how we can provide tool support for that. Here we are in the design phase, and we're also ready to present that very soon. And then there are other features like front-end support and support for initial token distribution. So we also didn't forget about all of that. This is just for some context, what is going on. But as I said, today we'll focus on the governance. So let's first look at how this new governance canister for the SNS relates to the NNS governance canister. As I already mentioned, we want to simplify it, and therefore we do not just reuse the NNS governance canister. Specifically, we want to omit some NNS specific details and reuse only those parts that are relevant. Therefore, we propose to actually go for a new code base. Of course, we can still reuse the things that are useful. Nevertheless, we propose to basically keep the two main concepts that we have in the NNS canister. First, we want, of course, to be able to enable the community to make changes to the DApp, so to make proposals, how this DApp can be changed, and then vote on them. Therefore, we propose to keep proposals. This is a concept that we already have in the NNS, which are such basically suggestions how something should be changed. Moreover, we want to be able to support staking so that people who participate in governance are invested in governance and therefore are incentivized to vote in the long-term interest of the DApp. And for this purpose, we propose to also keep the concept of neurons that we have in the NNS. And those neurons basically just denote the participants of the governance, and they are basically staked or contain staked tokens. And finally,
hey, Laura, sorry.
Yeah.
Hey, sorry to interrupt. We have a question from the previous slide. I just didn't want to let it slip just because I know there's a lot of, in case we forget what the topic is about. But in the last slide, you listed front-end support as a further objective. What does that allude to? Can you elaborate?
I should elaborate on what I mean by front-end support, sorry.
Yeah, under future features,
Okay, right. Sure. Yeah, so I mean, what it means in detail will have to be defined, right? And again, we will of course present what we have in mind, but I imagine something similar than what we have in the NNS. So for example, in the NNS, we have this NNS front-end tab where you can see your neurons, where you can see the proposals and vote on them. So the idea would probably be to provide something similar for SNSs that then each SNS can take, so that the SNS users can also use this front end for voting. That would kind of be the minimal thing, I guess. or to provide, we also talked about just providing some maybe libraries that all of this can actually be integrated in basically the dApps themselves, because the dApp probably already have a front end. So they might just want to have kind of support to integrate all of this voting in the interfaces that they already have. Yeah, but how this is best done, I guess, will be defined within this context, and then of course also discussed with the community.
Cool. And another question while we're at it, and this might be also just something defined for the future, does the token distribution include an auction feature?
I think that's also still under discussion. And again, something that we would also bring back to the community. That was the original idea in the very original SNS design. But I think there were other ideas, going around in the meantime that might not necessarily include an auction. I think it's still open to my knowledge.
Okay, awesome. Sorry to interrupt. Please continue.
No worries. Thanks. Right, where were we? Okay, yeah. Exactly. So in addition to the proposal and the neurons, we also propose that the actual token balance of the neurons will be stored on the ledger. So even though I said this talk will not be about other canisters, and it will also not be, but basically just the governance canister assumes that there is some ledger that has APIs that allows to store these tokens on this ledger. And this is also a good maybe point to point out that the SNS, so that the vision would be that each SNS would actually have its own governance token, just to make that specific. Right, so taking all of this together, what would the submission of a proposal look like? So let's assume the purple user would like to suggest to upgrade the DApp to a new version. To do so, they could send a proposal to the SNS. And if the proposal is valid and all checks out, then this proposal would be added to the list of proposals on the governance canister. Then other users that also have a neuron can then vote on this proposal. And here I want to note that even though only neuron holders can vote on the proposal or make a proposal, basically everyone in the world can stake tokens in a neuron. So this is really an open governance where everyone can participate. And if the majority of those voters then voted to adopt the proposal, this decision will be automatically executed in a chain. So in that case, this will mean that when the proposal is adopted, a method is called that will upgrade the DApp to this new green version. So if you know the NNS, you can see that the high level idea is really very similar. But let's now maybe go into a little bit more details of how the proposals and the neurons would look like, and also see how this differs a little bit from what we currently have on the NNS. So let's first look at proposals. In the NNS, proposals have both topics and types. So a proposal's topic is basically what facilitates following or liquid democracy. So you might know that if I have a neuron, I can delegate my vote to another neuron, which would then mean that whenever this other neuron votes, the governance canister would automatically also register a vote for me. And this, of course, has advantages. For example, if I'm not an expert, I can delegate my vote to an expert. Or also, if I just don't have time to vote on all proposals, I may choose to follow another neuron. So this is maybe what you have interacted with if you used the front-end tab and you enabled your neuron to follow other neurons. Then proposals also have a type, which basically defines what is the proposal's effect. So normally a proposal defines a method on a canister that should be called if this proposal is adopted. And this type basically defines this effect. So that means that different proposal types actually fall into the same topic. So you can see here an example screenshot from the NNS front-end tab. You might know the motion proposals, and the motion is actually a type which has the topic governance. And there are actually also other proposal types that fall under this governance topic. Now, how do we propose to make this different in the SNSs? So we cannot really predict what topics will be needed in the different SNSs, because of course they will serve a variety of different dApps and might have totally different topics. Therefore, we propose to omit the topics altogether, and we propose to allow following or liquid democracy based on the proposal types. Now, what proposal types do we propose to support in the first version? So again, here we suggest to start with a few proposal types that are likely needed in all the governance systems, and then to add new types of proposals in the future, also, of course, adding support for SNS-specific proposals. So we think that the following three are likely proposal types that will be needed by all or most of the governance systems. First, we propose to have motion proposals. Similarly to those in the NNS, they basically just probe the community's opinion about something and don't have an immediate effect. So for example, the foundation uses this to ask the community, should we even start working on some things? Then, of course, very central to the purpose of the SNS We want to allow debt that is associated with the SNS to be upgraded. Therefore, we propose to have the proposal type to upgrade a canister. And finally, we propose to have a proposal type to change the SNS parameters, which would then allow each of the SNSs to basically choose their own configurations according to the community needs. So let's next look at a very high level, what's the life cycle of a proposal? And we propose that this will work very similarly to the NNS, and therefore I will first explain how the proposal lifecycle currently looks like in the NNS, and then point out some things that we might want to make configurable for the SNS. So let's look at a simple example where we have one proposal and we have 6 voters that all have a neuron in the governance canister. Let's also look at the same example that we have already seen, where the purple user proposes to upgrade the depth canister to a new green version. So on submission of a proposal, assuming that the purple user actually has an eligible neuron, a proposal will be created on the governance canister. And the first thing that this proposal says is the proposal type. So what is this proposal about? And the proposal, as we've mentioned, defines a method that should be called if the proposal is adopted. And in this case, it says that the method that's called upgrade dep should be called. And it also defines the parameters of this method, which is basically the green WASM canister WASM that should be deployed on the dep. When a proposal is created, the governance canister also creates a first empty tally, basically. So for each voter, it is established how much voting power this voter has. And together with this voting power, we just register an empty vote, which is denoted by this quotation mark. And we will then fill in the votes when the people vote. The proposal is also initialized with an initial voting period, and currently in the NNS, this is 4 days. And finally, for the neuron that has submitted the proposal, we already record a yes vote, because basically this user has already said that they support this decision. So then other neuron holders can vote, and whenever they do so, we will just register their vote with the empty ballot that already exists. And like this, all the neurons that are eligible can then vote, and at some point the proposal will be decided, and we will now see what that means. So no matter how much time there's left how much voting period is left, whenever there more than half of the voting power voted yes, then the proposal is adopted. So you can see here in this example that at this point in time, and we still have a lot of voting period left, we have 300 yes votes that support the proposal, and the total voting power is 500. So basically, no matter how the others would decide, there's no way that it's not the case that the majority is in favor of the proposal. Therefore, we don't wait any longer, and we adopt the proposal and can actually execute it. Conversely, at any point in time, if there are half or this should be, I think this sign is wrong here, I'm sorry. If there are half or more no votes, then the proposal is rejected. Sorry. So you can see in the example on the right, we have 250 no votes out of 500. And again, no matter how much voting time is left, we know there's no way that the result can be turned around, and therefore the proposal is rejected. And if those two cases both haven't happened and the voting period is over, so you can see here on the right, it's at 0, then we adopt the proposal if there are more yes than no votes, and the number of yes votes are more than 3% of the total voting power. So in our example, the initial vote would actually be sufficient for that. We would have 100 yes votes, no vote, and the 3% of the total voting power would only be 15 votes. So the voting power of this initial voter would actually be sufficient to adopt this proposal. And one detail that actually influences all of that and specifically influences the voting period is our wait for quiet algorithm. So basically what wait for quiet does is whenever the voting trend changes, it increases the voting period. And by vote trend, what I mean is if the result would currently be yes before a vote is cast, but then a vote is cast and this makes the result turn into a no result, this is a trend change, and then the voting period would be increased. So you can see here that we might end up with a voting period that's actually bigger than what we started off with. But we also only allow this increase up to a certain extent, namely there's a maximum voting period that we can increase to, and this is currently 8 days in the NNS. So I hope this helped you to understand how proposals now work in the NNS. And as I said, we propose to keep this very similar in the SNS. I think there are two main obvious questions regarding SNSs where we might want to make these things configurable per SNS. The first one is voting power. So currently the voting power in the NNS depends on three things: the neuron state, age, and dissolve delay. And we will go into a little bit more detail what's the latter two mean later. So basically the easiest thing that we could do is we could just stick with what we have in the NNS for the SNS. Then the next thing that we could do is we could just add flexibility to the factors. So basically each SNS could say what weight they want to give to those three factors. And finally, what would probably be the nicest in the long term is to allow each SNS to basically choose their own function according to which the voting power should be computed. So here we propose to do the last step in the next release, as we mentioned in the beginning, because this will just be some additional work. Also, for wait for quiet, we might want some configurability. And the good news here is that both the initial voting period and the maximum time that we can increase the voting period are already parameters in the NNS. So you might know that we actually recently changed them in the NNS. So this can already be made configurable by SNSs. All right, so when we now looked at one of the main ingredients of the governance canister, let's now also look at neurons. So first, let's look at the neuron attributes. Here we propose something a bit different than in the NNS. So many of the attributes will still be in common, but we propose to drop some of the NNS-specific attributes. So let's just go through them. First, as in the NNS, a neuron should probably have a state, which are just the state tokens. And then I already mentioned that the neuron actually points to a letter account where the actual tokens are stored. So in the NNS, the neurons actually additionally have a neuron ID that uniquely identifies the neuron. However, this account is actually also unique per neuron. Therefore, we newly propose in the SNS to just reuse this letter account as the ID and not have an additional ID. Next, we have to define who can change the neuron or vote on behalf of the neuron. And in the NNS, we have the concept of a controller that can do everything with a neuron and the concept of hotkeys with just limited privileges. For the SNSs, we propose something more flexible. We propose an access control list where basically everyone can define for each key what privileges this key should have. Again, we propose to have a simple version of that in the first iteration and maybe just a fixed control list and then later add the flexibility to change this by user or by SNS or probably both. Then a few things we propose to leave as in the NNS, for example, just the creation time when a neuron was created. And we also propose to keep the dissolve state as in the NNS. So the dissolve state allows for schemes where community members that commit to stake their tokens for a certain time can be rewarded more than others that just keep their stake tokens for a brief time. Basically, how this works now in the NNS, and we propose to keep that, is that we have this dissolve delay, which basically is a timer that says the tokens can only be liquidated again if the timer is run down. And either the neuron can be in a dissolving state, which means that the timer is running down, or it can be in a non-dissolving state, which means that the timer is stopped at the moment. And we then also have the concept of an age, which means basically determines how long the neuron has been in a non-dissolving state. So this might have been a bit fast, but I think the very details of that are not so important to understand the rest of the talk. So I already briefly mentioned following. Also similar to the NNS, we propose to facilitate liquid democracy. And for that, the neurons have to be able to define which other neurons they want to follow for each of the proposal types. And finally, to facilitate that neurons can be rewarded for their participation in governance, we also propose to have maturity as in the NNS. So maturity basically just denotes how many token equivalent has this neuron already collected as rewards. And this is what is denoted here at the very bottom. Already, so after the neuron attributes, let's now look at what one can do with a neuron. So the neuron commands. So again, we propose commands similar to the NNS, but only a subset thereof. So first, we of course require some methods to get a neuron, so to stake tokens, which we call claim neuron, and then eventually to liquidate the tokens again out of the neuron, which we call dispersed neuron. And then we also want to allow users to add more stake to an existing neuron, which is top up a neuron. Then once a neuron has stake, it should of course be able to participate in governance. Therefore, we should allow a neuron to make a proposal, vote on a proposal, or change this following setting to allow for this liquid democracy. Then, of course, the configuration should be changeable. So as with the NNS, we propose that the neuron can change from dissolving to non-dissolving state and back, which you can see here from the first to the second, basically. And then a neuron should also be allowed to increase the dissolve delay. So basically to say, I'm fine with committing to my stake tokens longer, but it's never allowed to decrease this timer. This can only be done by basically waiting until the time is up. Then, if neurons get rewards, of course, they should be able to do something with those rewards that they have collected. So recall that the maturity just tracks how many rewards a neuron has collected, but those are actually not yet minted tokens. So there are two possibilities what a neuron can do with this maturity. Either it can so-called spawn this into a new neuron. And what this means is that these tokens would actually be minted and then are staked in a new neuron. But the advantage of that is that this new neuron has actually a small dissolve delay, so the tokens can be liquidated very soon, while the original tokens in the original neuron on the left are still staked for a long time. So this is basically a mechanism that allows neuron holders to continuously get out their rewards, even though the staked tokens are staked for a really long time. Now, instead of continuously getting the rewards, one might also choose to basically reinvest the maturity. And this is what we call merge maturity. Someone that chooses to merge the maturity would basically, the effect of that would be that the tokens are again minted and just added to the neuron stake. So to make SNSs flexible, we propose to make most of the neuron relevant factors configurable. So we actually have many factors. For example, what's the minimum stake of a neuron? What's the maximum dissolve delay that users can set the dissolve delay to, and so forth. So we propose to make most of these things flexible. that each SNS can basically choose it themselves. Then another thing that's a kind of a thing that people might want to choose themselves are the rewards. And in the best case, of course, it should be fully up to the SNSs to define this. Again, here we propose to have in a first version just kind of take the rewards as we have them in the NNS, and then in a later version make this more configurable, because again, this will require some more time. So overall in this talk, we wanted to talk about the SNS governance. We saw that the main concepts that we propose are similar to the NNS, namely the proposals and the neurons, but we aim to make things more flexible by allowing some parameters to be chosen by the SNS. And we also aim to make things simpler by omitting, for example, neuron attributes and neuron commands that are NNS specific and that will not be needed in the SNS. Right, so that's already the end of my talk, and I'm now happy to take questions.
All right, Laura, I hope you're ready. There are a lot of questions for you today.
I hope so too.
Cool. Absolutely. And thanks to everyone in from Definity in the chat who's been answering questions as well. For the sake of people watching on YouTube, I'm going to ask everything so everything's captured. Okay, you ready, Laura?
Sure. Let's see.
First question. First question. Which data types will we be able to store in the ledger canister?
Sorry, what does it mean?
Sorry. Like what types of data can you store in the ledger canister?
Store. Sorry, I didn't understand that. So I'm not sure what the question is really about, because I mean, as I said, I guess this talk wasn't really supposed to be about the ledger canister. I can maybe say what the governance canister assumes about the ledger canister it interacts with, because maybe the question was going in this direction. So basically, in the current governance implementation, we assume a ledger that has a concept of sub-accounts. Currently, all the neurons are basically stored in sub-accounts of an account that is owned by the governance canister. And basically, we follow this scheme to see how many tokens each of the neuron has. So I think that would be, for example, one feature that currently a ledger would need to be able to interact with this governance system. But I mean, additional things, I guess, can always be stored, right? So yeah, I'm not sure I answered the question.
Thank you. Okay, thank you, Laura. Next question. Eventually, when the NNS manages SNS dApps, won't dApps need to follow a standard template that they can't easily deviate from?
So by template, does it mean the SNSs need to basically follow a specific implementation? Or so I can maybe, so I mean, that's also something that we actually discuss in this other feature that I said we're working about, on how we actually deploy and upgrade SNS canisters. And so basically we'll have a more concrete proposal of how we see the design for that, I think, in the upcoming weeks, and we can probably discuss it then in even more detail. So, I mean, as I said, at all times, developers can choose to deviate as they want. If they just deploy what we published, for example, as open source code, they can deploy that, of course, and deviate from that all the time. Current thinking is that we envision also kind of one version where the NNS would take care for you that you don't miss any upgrades, and maybe even do that automatically. So in that case, you would follow basically, I guess, what was called the template in the question. So I think there will probably be all variants in the wild, right? Those that choose to do something fully differently, those that choose to have automatic upgrades, and then for future features, so, it will of course depend what the minimal requirements are, right? For example, if you probably want to use the front end support, you might need to have some requirements on your APIs that this works well. Yeah, so that's kind of hard to predict, I guess, in detail.
Cool. Thank you, Laura. So will the ICNNS support individual depths voting, or is that something that's still up for debate?
Again, I'm not 100% sure what is meant by individual depth voting over the NNS. I mean, the NNS,
yeah. Oh, okay. The way I'm reading this question, feel free to clarify in chat if you ask this question, is so if you have SNS and you have like your own governance, like, does that roll up to the NNS? Like, will there be like a tab in the NNS app where you can see, you know, if you're like have tokens which enable you to vote in like a particular DAO, for example, that you could see a dashboard of like all the outstanding votes essentially.
I see. Okay. Yeah, so I think that's something that we at least had in mind. This would be part of this front end work again, how we integrate this. I think at some point the idea was that we could have at least kind of a list or an overview of some sort of the SNS neurons that one has all in the NNS front end tab. But I think we will have to discuss what this might look like in detail.
Cool. Thank you, Laura. So question, people in the developer forum questioned why the initial action for creating an SNS is an NNS proposal at all, as opposed to creating a canister. I believe the design intent is that if a developer creates an NNS proposal, that the developer can rely on the decentralization properties of the NNS from the app's inception, which relies on decentralization properties of the IC. Am I thinking about this correctly? And caveat, of course, since code is open source, devs can strip the submit NNS proposal part.
Right. So again, it's actually, I mean, this is actually something that will be discussed within the next feature, right? If indeed each SNS deployment requires an NNS proposal. Also, I think another basically advantage of going this route could be that you could get more automation. So you could basically say, I opt in for having this NNS controlled SNS and going over this approval by the NNS community. And then what I basically get is that the NNS will take care that my SNS is always in the newest version, that, for example, if it has a security bug, it will be upgraded automatically and all of that. So I think that's the current thinking. I think in the very initial proposal, this was also a bit coupled together with this auction idea. So if I think maybe that was also meant by the question, because it was somehow this decentralization aspect was also mentioned. So again, I think all of this comes into play if we talk again about how we want to support initial token distribution. So I'm sorry, I think a lot of questions actually tackle what we will probably cover in 1 or 2 weeks.
That's okay. That's okay. I think that's still good to know for the crowd here. Thank you, Laura. Okay, so another question. Let's say people are setting up SNS. Is it possible to do that without neurons? Like, what if people don't want to have neurons in the design?
Right. So I guess, so as I said, of course, you can always take the code and change it. It probably depends on what you mean by not having neurons. So if you just don't want to have staked tokens with a certain dissolve delay, then, and you don't care that they're just nevertheless called neurons, you might be able to actually just set the settings in the governance canister accordingly. So for example, you can say that no matter how much dissolve delay you have the same voting power, or no matter how much dissolve, or maybe state it the other way around. You can maybe say that you cannot increase the dissolve delay, or the dissolve delay of a neuron is just irrelevant to anything else, and you can at any point take the tokens out again. So by this, I think you would kind of just disable what maybe makes a neuron special compared to other staking options. So yeah, they would still be called neurons, I guess, but you might be able to kind of play around with the configurations and then get a governance system that doesn't follow these ideas.
Cool. Thank you, Laura. So I think this is more maybe a general governance question. Besides getting people to vote the same as they do, is there any other incentive to getting people to follow your voting?
So sorry, I didn't get the last part. Is there an incentive to follow?
Yeah, so basically the way I'm reading this is if you're following like somebody's neuron, other than being able to like maximize your voting power directionally, is there any other incentive to get people to follow your neuron?
So as a followee, basically, is there an incentive to make people follow me?
Exactly, yeah.
Good question. I mean, the incentive I want to convince, I mean, indirectly, I want to convince people that if I care a lot about a decision, right, then I have, of course, an advantage if many people follow me, because it's more likely that my opinion will actually basically win the vote. But I don't think there's like a direct incentive at the moment, at least in terms of you get more rewards if you're a neuron that's being followed or something. And that's, of course, something that we could think about, right? But I don't think that's currently the case now.
Cool. Thanks, Laura. Next question. Can neuron owners vote on changing SNS parameter proposals without the Canister code being open source, provided that the Canister WASM hash is verified to be from the SNS?
Right. So that's a really good question. I even have some backup slides. So it's actually a really good question. And maybe I can quickly show them, I think. So in the NNS, we actually both have what we call constants and what we call network economics. And the difference between that is exactly, I think, what was mentioned. So if we want to change the so-called constants, we have to do a canister upgrade. So just to mention, both of these can only be changed by proposal, as everything, right? But the effect of the proposal will be different. So if we want to change those constants, we actually have to change the canister code and do a canister upgrade, and then that would result in a new WASM. But we also have what we call the network economics in the NNS. And basically, the effect of such a proposal is just to call a method that will change certain values, and this would then still be the same WASM code. So basically, the proposal for the SNS would be to just push most of the things in the second category so that certain things can be changed, while basically the canister code is still the same. Yeah, hope that makes sense.
Cool, awesome. I'm laughing because David Alves just wrote in chat. He's like, I realized that all of these questions I've been answering have just been going to the host. That's actually really funny. Sorry about that, David. We're asking all the questions now anyway. Cool. Next question. So why not develop a flexible API for developers to create their own topics for a given dApp? This seems like a relatively simple build, but maybe I'm missing something. Type-only liquid democracy seems like it would hamstring the SNS pattern.
So I didn't get the last part, but I think the question was about the proposal topics, right? Why we couldn't just allow the SNSs to kind of have an API. So right. I think in the end, exactly. it's more, I mean, a question of whether we call them topics or type. It just seems that the topic is an overall concept and the type is really the the lowest concept. So if we, for example, do following based on these topics, I guess we just have more use cases that we cover. So actually, the proposal would be, so as I said, we don't really know what kinds of proposals the SNSs will provide, right? So the proposal would actually be to have these SNS specific proposals in a new canister that then each SNS can decide kind of what kinds of proposal they want to have. So basically, this is not something we propose for the first version because it should be minimal. But there, I guess you could also maybe take together several topics or several types or do something more elaborate. But yeah, I think the reason to just do following based on the topics is that, yeah, it seems to be the simpler thing to now abstract away this topic layer that we don't really need.
Cool. Thanks, Laura. So we do have a bunch of questions to get through. So thank you for being such a good sport about everything. So the next question is the SNS voting mechanism, for example, with features like wait for quiet and absolute majority and so on and so forth. Is that different from the NNS because the mechanics seem identical?
Right. So what I explained is actually what's now happening in the NNS. And the proposal would be in this first version to have these mechanics really similar because that's also minimal effort. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. The next one is interesting. So I'm curious as to how voters will understand exactly what it is that they're voting on, because incentivizing people to vote is not the same as incentivizing them to learn what's being voted on. I think that's a great general kind of issue with governance and overall, regardless if you're talking about crypto governance or just political governance in the real world.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. And I think, the incentive should be that, of course, it's also in your interest to make good decisions because in the end you have staked tokens. And if bad decisions are made, this might influence your tokens as well, right? So at least I think we do have this indirect incentive that people should actually care about what they vote on or who they delegate their vote to. But yeah, I don't think I have a good question how we can resolve this other than trying to explain really well what the different proposals are about, right? And trying to engage with the community that they actually understand what the different, and that we all educate ourselves among each other to make sure we know what we're voting on. Yeah.
For sure. And thanks. I told you you're going to be in the hot seat. So thank you for being such a good sport with all these questions. So the next question is somewhat related. Currently, discussion for NNS topics is handled in a Dfinity hosted forum. Will any sort of discussion forum be provided as part of SNS implementation, or is it your own responsibility for your project?
That's a good question. I don't think we have currently plans to provide something like this for an SNS. I could also imagine that depending on the dApp, they have their own ideas. They might already have a place where their community has discussions and meets, right? So maybe that's also not necessarily something that we want to say what's the best solution for each of the SNSs. So I'm not aware that we plan to do that, but we could of course think about if the community thinks that's something that they want, like also kind of a standard or something that they can follow.
Totally. And I also think that's not necessarily on the Dfinity Foundation either. That's also something that could be like a community-based initiative if somebody wants to create some kind of dashboard to keep yourself informed and also, aggregate all ongoing votes for, DAOs or SNSs that you're part of. I think that feel free to take the reins. I think that not everything needs to come from Dfinity, and nor should it, right? Because we're aiming to be as decentralized as possible. Cool. So next question. I like this one. I wonder if the NNS governance model, for example, with neurons and staking and terminology, like dissolve delay. I wonder if that's too complicated for normal users who might not know about ICP. After all, the end goal is to have everyday users use these applications, not just blockchain enthusiasts. And it's arguably already too complicated for diehard enthusiasts. So what are your thoughts on making something like SNS palatable and digestible for the everyday person?
Yeah. So I think it's a little bit a trade-off, right? I think the advantage of keeping the terminology is that the user of the NNS will understand exactly what's going on. And of course, we also want to bring them on board, right? But overall, I agree that, of course, these are new concepts for people that are not familiar with the IC. I mean, I think there may be two answers here. First, I think we just have to continuously do a good job in explaining these concepts. I think Neurons, they might have a weird name, but the concept of staking tokens, for example, is not new, right? The dissolve delay, maybe we should kind of have another extra session just to explain how all of this works in detail. I think if one thinks about it a little bit, it's actually not that complicated, but of course, users have to invest the time to actually want to understand all of that. I guess the other thing that I want to mention is that some of these things might be abstracted away in the front end, right? If we do a good job on the front end side, I mean, users still have to understand what's going on, but at least they might not need to understand all the neuron attributes that, for example, I presented today. Some of the things, I guess, like a neuron has an account on the ledger and all of that, you might not have to understand in detail what goes on behind the scenes if you have a front end that's designed well, I think. But yeah, I think it's a good point and something we should, address.
Cool, thanks, Laura. Next question. If we don't want our DAO to have a concept of staking or voting rewards, just the most simple possible model, like one token, one vote per proposal, will that be configurable with the current design?
Let me think about it. I think, so as I said, I think for the first version, our proposal would be to have the voting rewards as in the NNS, just to have a first version soon. Other than that, as I mentioned, if you, for example, just set the dissolve delay accordingly, I think you might get a version where you can just have basically voting power, just one token, one vote concept by, for example, just configuring the voting power to be based on just the stake tokens and nothing else. Basically, I can't promise anything, but I envision a future version of the SNS where you can make the configurations like that. But I would assume that the first version, at least as we propose it today, would maybe not allow for all of that.
Thank you, Laura. Okay, so in the interest of time, I'm going to take one more question. So, right, so this covers some of the basics, and it does make sense that we're going to iterate upon this kind of design. What's coming next? When will implementation occur? Do we have any rough roadmap details available? And where can people find out more information about this?
So I think the best information, the best source for finding more information is on the forum. We have a thread just basically proposing this design, which also has as a time outline. So the idea would be that we have another talk on this topic on Thursday, and then we'll issue a motion proposal. And there I think you can find more information on all of that.
Cool. I'm just taking a look at the, actually the talk on Thursday needs to be rescheduled. So it will not happen this Thursday, but it will happen at a later date and time. I know we're at time.
I didn't know that yet, okay.
No, it's okay. I need to reschedule it. So Big shout out to Laura for this wonderful presentation. Thank you, community members, for being so engaged. Thank you, Dfinity team members, for fielding all of the questions in the chat. And we will see you all next time at a future community conversation. Bye, everyone. Take care.
Bye.